It's great to be here this morning. How is everyone? Good morning. We've got great energy here today. I'm so honored to be here. It's really a pleasure for me. Thank you to John Maeda for inviting me. Thank you to Kylie Lambert and to Carrie Gottschalk for all that you've done to make the commute here beautiful and fun. I had in mind a talk I wanted to give you today, and it was very much along the lines of what I often discuss. And it's about the improbable foundations of creativity. I was going to tell you about this as I've written about it in my book, The Rise, Creativity, the Gift of Failure, and the Search for Mastery. I decided to write this book and to start speaking about it more broadly because I came to see, as a curator at MoMA and the Tate Modern, and critic at Yale School of Art, and an author often writing on the works of contemporary artists, that the very iconic works that we often celebrate had unusual foundations more often than not. I learned as a very young person these certain stories. I learned that Duke Ellington said, "I merely took the energy it takes to pout and wrote some blues." I learned that Thomas Edison told his assistant, incredulous the inventor's repeated attempts to invent the incandescent light bulb, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." I learned that the choreographer and dancer Paul Taylor's early piece that crystallized his now iconic minimalist style in 1957 was so panned that the reviewer left the newsprint completely blank. Just stated Paul Taylor's dance company's name and the reviewer's own initials at the bottom. It's a scandal, Bill T. Jones told me, for the dance community that receives so little coverage in print anyway. Paul Taylor, when he remarked on that newsprint, he said, and it wasn't even a very big blank. It was just a tiny piece. I learned that the 1930s RKO screen tests that stated, "can't sing, can't act, balding, can dance a little," was in reference to Fred Astaire. I learned that Martin Luther King, during seminary, when he received mainly A's and B's, received C's twice. In what class? Can you guess? Exactly. He actually was worse the next semester. He received a C+ and then a C the following semester. I wonder what that teacher thought when he went on to lead our nation with the power of his spoken truth. J.K. Rowling famously discussed at her Harvard University commencement speech the fringe benefits of failure. She said that rock bottom became the solid foundation on which she built her rise. And Oprah Winfrey followed suit a few years later at Harvard, giving a commencement speech along the same lines. All these stories made me rethink the true nature of triumph and creative endeavors and mastery. It made me realize that we were essentially sanitizing the stories of the icons who we celebrate oftentimes once they've achieved a certain level of acclaim. I was going to tell you all about the traits that I see in these icons, and there are really three. I noticed that people tend to focus, if they're going to glean a gift of all these different kind of failures I've described, they focus on mastery and not merely success. If success is an event, mastery is a journey. It's focusing and making sure you're attentive to these near wins, the gap between where you are and where you want to go. How often have we lurked at what we might call a masterpiece and not known that the artist thought that it actually fell short of his or her goals? And because of that, they had the propulsion to move forward more often than we could know. Think of a painter who I love, Paul Cézanne. He didn't sign 90% of his paintings because he didn't feel they met his goal to, as he put it, realize nature in paint. It helped him complete the 10% he did sign. And in large part, it's why we have the large body of works we do by Paul Cézanne. Think of the novelist William Faulkner. When he published The Sound and the Fury, it went on to its acclaim, but he wasn't satisfied with it. He rewrote sections of that book 5 different times and published it as an appendix to the novel's later editions. In a sense, mastery has inbuilt a sense of the incomplete, sort of best summarized by a quote that is a short prayer Michelangelo stated. He said, "Lord, grant that I desire more than I can accomplish." And this is what mastery is about. It's about caring about that near win. So I was going to tell you all about that. I was going to talk about the gift of the deliberate amateur. Masters know that ultimately to see a problem anew, you need to eventually give up your expertise to retain the curiosity of the child, the wonder of the child, and I'll speak more about that today. I was going to also talk about the power of grit, the ability to withstand failure feedback over not just years, but decades, as Angela Duckworth has shown us in her now MacArthur-winning work. She's a psychologist based at the University of Pennsylvania who's explored this idea. I went to her because I wanted to understand for creative folks how grit turns not into dysfunctional persistence, which it can be if you pursue a goal that doesn't get you anywhere, but a more nimble trait that can help us over time. I was thinking about someone like a Samuel Morse, who invented the telegraph, as we know, but spent 26 years prior to that in the failed pursuit of being a painter. He converted the stretcher bars of one of his paintings into the telegraph itself. The failed foundations of one endeavor as the foundation of what President Obama said to Michael Lewis one day when he was being interviewed for a Vanity Fair article is the start of the internet, and it is. Samuel Morse is the first tech entrepreneur, you might say, but he does show us this nimble quality of grit, the ability to change your kind of lower level tactics to still meet a higher level goal. In his case, it was invention. But I decided that I couldn't just speak about the tactics to create something new for the world without giving more airtime to what I'm not often permitted to discuss when I'm invited to conferences, because they want me to speak about all of that. And it is what the stakes are for not speaking about what is lost when we don't honor the force of anything creative in our lives. And what I'm getting at really is the power of wonder. I do what I do as a curator and an author and critic at Yale and now at Harvard as a Boyce Fellow, not so much because I want to honor the individual pursuit or even genius of an individual's work, but because of the power of aesthetic force, you might say, in us. How do the arts move us? How does anything move us? And why is it so important? The theme of PopTech, rebellion, made me want to speak about this. This country came to understand the power of wonder and the power of the arts during one of our most extreme times of revolution and rebellion. You know what I'm talking about, the Civil War. During this period, one man wanted to emphasize for this country what's lost when we don't honor the creative process at a time that stunned his audience because they were not expecting it. This happened in Boston, Tremont Temple in 1861. This man, this famed orator who I'll tell you about, was really known for action. At a time when orators were analogous to star athletes and the stage was comparable to a boxing ring, people said about this man that his will, skill, and style proved to nearly all that he was extraordinary. As one journalist put it, a man cut out for a hero. He went on to say that as a speaker, he has few equals. And this man is Frederick Douglass. The slide will come in a minute, I hope. There we go. Douglass was speaking at a time that you might call the age of the daguerreotype, when images were now populating homes, being pushed at you when you'd enter them. People were asked to give their opinion of these new pictures that created, as much as the telegraph did, a sense of wonder about what was possible to invent in one's time. Douglass called this speech that he gave in Boston's Tremont Temple life pictures, and later, pictures and progress. His argument was that it would not be revolution or violence alone that would get America to see itself anew, but something as small as really a trifle in the context of the magnitude of war, a picture, a snapshot. His argument was not that the picture alone had force, but that it could create in us what he called a thought picture. It would give us, as he argued, not just a new vision of what we wanted to see in our world, but through the distance between the vision we gained and the work in front of us, enough criticality to have the inspiration to do something about it. I love this speech. What this speech reminds me of is the importance of the arts, not just as a luxury, a kind of a respite from life, but of material, kind of a dynamic that's behind some of our most impactful changes in the world. How many times has a thought picture, an image, something with great beauty or aesthetic force changed our notion of the world entirely in a way that rational argument alone could not? More times than we often admit. Historically, there are many examples. Famously, many historians have reminded us that the broadside of the slave ship Brooks, in the 18th century, that showed with graphic precision how, in fact, you do get 748 men, women, and children into the hull of a ship that's meant to inhumanely hold 450, is what swayed Parliament to finally, in Britain, abolish the slave trade. A more contemporary example, environmentalists will tell you that it was this image, Earthrise, taken from Apollo 8, of our planet floating in its orbit, that reminded us that we are in an environment that we need to protect. There are many examples of this, but what I began to consider as I was coming today is why wonder has such efficacy, why the arts have such efficacy, what's lost when we don't honor them. One of the reasons is that the arts create a private domain in us. They let us have a safe space to make iconoclastic decisions. They let us reconsider the world safely and then take the risks required to live out the change we want to see. Another historic example, Thomas Jefferson knew it in a letter he wrote to a friend. He said in front of a painting that it fixed him like a statue for a quarter of an hour or half an hour. I do not know which, for I lost all ideas of time, even the consciousness of my own existence. These private domains occur everywhere in the creative process. This is an image of Albert Einstein's study on the last day of his life in 1955, the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton. And I love that dense display of papers, that show this large mission he had to create what he called the theory of everything, right? And the energy that he clearly had to live it out, and the sense that he thought he was coming back, the back-turned chair suggesting that sort of thought of re-entry. But he called his studies, his places where he could work, worldly cloisters. That gets at the paradox of the creative process, the paradox of what happens when you invent anything. You need a private domain before you put the work out into the world. But the arts do this for us even when we don't do it for ourselves. Think about what happens when we improvise. If you look at the work of Alan Lim and Charles Braun and Alan Lim, from Johns Hopkins, they've looked at what is occurring in jazz musicians' brains during the state of improvisation and found something I think is stunning, really. What they found is that the brain is most close to the state it's in during improvisation during the period of REM sleep, when we're dreaming. In other words, in that moment when we are creating, We are barricading ourselves from self-critique. We have a private domain to consider things anew. Think of what happened one day in early 20th century when a man named Charles Black was so stunned by the force of music that he created a private domain in himself that affected our world indelibly today. I'm going to fast forward through a few slides to get us to this. He went to a dance, Charles Black. He was 16, teenager, just wanting to meet some girls at this college dance. He found himself instead with a friend of his just struck still by the power of this man's horn, a man who he had never heard of, who he knew in that moment as he was standing there was a genius. He understood in that moment in 1931 that because this man was a genius and this man was Louis Armstrong, I'm showing you here, that everything in his world that he had believed in, segregation, must be wrong. Charles Black went on to become one of the lawyers for Brown versus Board of Education because of this moment, because of the force of the arts. He went on to then become a constitutional lawyer at Columbia and Yale, and every year held an Armstrong listening night to remind himself and his students and his community of the force of the arts for this country. All of this is really to say what I haven't had a full chance to before, and it's that the power of wonder, which is oftentimes brought about through the work that largely many of you might do in this room, is important for getting us to rethink what it means to live a contributory life. Oftentimes we think about that, a contributory life, in the context of service, officially. But what I'd like to make the case for today is that the arts are as important for a contributory life as anything else, irreplaceably so. Frederick Douglass, at the end of that speech in 1861, decided to rewrite it 4 different times to try to get closer to the truth of what he wanted to articulate that day. He did so up until the end of his life. The audience was slightly confused, as perhaps you are, about his idea, but he believed in it so firmly, and he knew that others had, that he wanted to do it justice. It's an old idea. It's not only Douglass's, of course. It's why Aristotle was so interested in the arts. As he famously said, reason alone is not enough to make men good, and was curious about the power of beauty, the power of aesthetic force. Douglass said at the end of his speech that it might take generations to understand the power of the arts for some of our most intractable failures as society. It might take a long time for us to understand that our greatest hope lies with our innovators and creatives to show us the world anew through the power of their work. And I hope I've offered you today a sense of why that's so critical and some of the examples in which we've lived it out. So thank you very much.